Colts at Redskins, Sunday Night Football. Marco, what should bettors be looking at?
The public's getting excited with this Washington Redskin team. 2 big wins back-to-back weeks, but I think they're overrated, and we'll talk about why in this video.
Okay, so I tend to agree. I think that everything has fallen really well for them, clearly other than that Houston loss. But I think beating the Cowboys, as I talked about in my last video, overrated perpetually, so not as big of a win as you'd think. I think the McNabb had that massive advantage in Philly that we talked about. The QB, after 6+ years, returning to his other team for the first game. It's now like 6 out of 7 or 7 out of 8. I can't remember. And I think Green Bay last week was very injured, and that's something that injuries are not accounted for by the public when the left tackle's out or that kind of stuff, or the running back that's not an all-pro. The public doesn't account for that as much. But again, this was a hobbled Green Bay team.
They were hobbled going in, RJ, and I watched that entire game last week because that was my best bet last week, and we ran it to 6-0.
Oh,
you may have heard,
but
Washington had all the benefits in that game, and not only, like I said, was Green Bay hurt going in, they had 3 key injuries during the game last week that depleted them even further. So everything's been falling into place for them. One thing that's helped Washington in their success, given all the stuff that we've just said, is they haven't had this before with McNabb. Now they've got McNabb and they got leadership. They don't turn the ball over. This team right now has only 4 turnovers. They protect the ball. The Colts do the same. They only have 5 turnovers. So you're going to have a clean game from both teams. When it comes down to it, they both become one-dimensional. Their running games are are lost. They've got offensive line problems. So if this is going to come down to a game where the quarterback's going to have to make the plays to win the ball game, you give me a toss-up between McNabb and Manning. That's not a toss-up to me.
All right, so let's talk about the Manning factor, because it's actually very prevalent in this game, like most Colts games. One is the Colts are 7-2 ATS as road favorites. And again, quarterback on the road. We talked about the Cowboys are likely going to have trouble in the Metrodome. Well, the Colts and Manning do really well on the road. I've heard a wise guy talk recently. They think their power rankings for the Colts on the road are almost identical to at home. They think they almost don't have a home field. They play so well on the road. Number 2, and this is something that Bill Simmons talks about a lot, Manning in prime time. This is a guy that steps up in prime time. He's covered 7 of 8 in night games and primetime games. So he loves the spotlight. And I found this one to be interesting. I'm not sure the pertinence. Manning has won 7 of 9 ATS against Shanahan. So there's something about the Shanahan defense that Manning's locked in on. So I think the Manning factor is really big here.
Right, and I'm going to point out what John Q. Public, as I like to refer to all the time, is going to look at games, and what they're going to see is they're going to say, this is not the Washington Redskin team that we've seen in the past. McNabb brings a new dimension, and that's true. They're also going to say, hey, look at the Colts. They're not the same team. They struggled last week against Kansas City, only winning 19-9. Kansas City was undefeated at the time. They're also going to point out the fact that Indianapolis has lost 2 out of 3 road games this year. And that's true. But what I'm going to point out is the 2 road games that they lost were both division games. Teams they play twice a year, that face Manning all the time, that have had a history against performing well.
But hold on a second. Last week we talked about Belichick, and we said when Belichick gets to see you a second time, or when he gets game film and it gets to be October, there's all these things that the cerebral, the thinking football player has advantages when he has history to look at. Wouldn't Manning have more an advantage against a team that they play regularly, more than twice a year, the divisional rivals? Because here's a guy that's going to know how to bait the defense. Here's a guy that, so if anything, you tell me you can have Manning play a team for the first time or the 100th time. If I want Manning, I want him on the 100th time.
The difference with that, RJ, and we disagree on these type of theories all the time, but I'll give you an example afterwards. Rivalry games, stats and strengths don't always play out the way they're supposed to be. Teams just play differently in rivalry games, and there's no question Houston, Indianapolis, and Jacksonville and
Yeah,
Indianapolis.
but Indianapolis had beat Houston 19 of 20 times before this
They
year.
did, but they were always close games.
All right.
They were always close games. Think back in the last 15 years, there's been such a disparity in the Pittsburgh Steelers and the Cleveland Browns. Agreed?
Yeah.
But how many times have the Browns given the Steelers fits because of that rivalry?
I usually think it's an easy. I'm thinking about Pittsburgh doing flea flickers late in the game when I think of the Browns. But all right, so continue on.
I say this, forget those 2 road games that they lost. The 1 road game that they played, there was a non-division game. They rolled over Denver. I think you're going to see that type of performance in Washington Sunday night. And let's face it, this is the 3rd week in a row for a big game for Washington. How many weeks
That's
in
true.
a row
That's a
can
good
you,
point. That's
can
a good
you
point.
still be
There's
playing?
got to be a flat spot. Give us your projection.
Indianapolis by 10, 27-17.
All right, good stuff. All right, continue the conversation in the comments section with me and Marco. And next up, we're going to be looking at it's not an exciting Monday night game, but you can still bet on it.